The man who has called himself the most pro-union president in history is facing a possible auto worker strike. President Joe Biden has been watching over the process United Auto Workers are engaging in. They're talking about negotiations with automakers, as laborers have threatened to strike if an agreement is not reached before their current contract expires at 11:59 p.m. tonight, the Washington Post reports.
This strike also threatens Joe Biden's clean energy agenda. How will the president protect the economy and keep his climate promises while protecting America's auto workers? That is a tall order and something that I don't think his track record so far necessarily sets him up for success on. It seems like a long time ago, but it wasn't all that long ago that there was the strike threatened by the rail unions. And obviously Joe Biden and his administration tried to portray him as being very involved in this. Secretary of Transportation Buttigieg was supposedly involved, and they supposedly had a deal that was then voted down by the actual union members working for these rail companies. And so then you had President Biden begging Congress to basically save his hide and enforce a contract on the union that the union members had voted down. So for somebody who claims to be the most pro-union president ever, is he really?
No, I mean, I would point to FDR for sure. I'd point to Ike, who wasn't so bad. I would definitely not think of Joe Biden. In the case of the rail workers' potential strike, there were multiple opportunities for the administration to be involved before this last-minute effort where the most basic demands were not met. It was a terrible situation where so many workers were pulling very long shifts. They were not given any sick days. People who are working, driving these trains for 16 hours and then coming home, they could get called back in at 3 a.m. and have to be there within 2 hours. This is someone driving a huge freight train on 2 hours of sleep. That is not something that is safe for the conductor of the train. It's not safe for anyone around the tracks. And just think about the basic human decency. You can't take a day off to see the birth of your child. If you're sick, if you have COVID, if you have to go to the hospital, you face this kind of a penalty where now you're owed days, or you owe days rather, to your employer, and you have to come in if you're called. It's a terrible situation. It's not how you treat human beings. It's certainly not even how you treat workers if you want to run a successful business. And Biden siding with the rail industry over the workers essentially was just the one thing that we can point to and say, absolutely not, you're not a pro-union president. In the case of the auto workers, you have to be on the side of the auto workers here. They signed a contract that they did not have to, taking pay and benefit cuts so that the auto industry wouldn't collapse. Now it's time that they be made whole again, considering the auto industry did not collapse thanks to them saying, we'll take the cut, we'll take the hit.
Well, and I think, obviously that's just sort of the labor union part of this problem that's looming, 11:59 p.m. tonight. But then obviously there's also, again, this clean energy angle. The Biden administration has been very dead set on this sort of forced energy, quote unquote, transition. We saw how that went recently when Energy Secretary Granholm attempted an EV road trip around the Southeast that ended in the police being called when one of her aides used a gasoline-powered vehicle to try to hold a space at an electric vehicle charging station. Do you think that this is going to end up being another hit to the president's attempts to sort of force this electric vehicle transition? And what sort of an effect will that have if he has to sort of, if it's seen as him having to give up part of that in order to take the side of the unions in this?
It would be the worst political decision of his career if he were to say, we're going to ensure degrowth of gasoline-powered vehicles by making workers bear the brunt of the decline in that industry. I think if you're President Joe Biden and you really want to push us towards green energy and actually have a future and do something about climate change, you would have to take this approach of workers are not bearing the burden. We're going to ensure anyone in an industry where we need to shift towards renewable energy, and maybe that means, a decrease in production of those making gas-powered automobiles. We really need to think about what this means for our economy and what's right for people. It can be tempting, I think, especially for members of the left, to say, let's punish the people who polluted the planet and contributed to climate change. No, we really need to be thinking about how we can move forward. How can the same mechanics, the same people who do the welding, all of that machinery, tools, land, workers, their expertise, how can we shift that towards maybe let's put them up to the task instead of creating automobiles to help build the infrastructure necessary to have our energy be reliant on renewable energy. That's something that I think their skills are pretty equipped to meet the challenge of. And so we really need to be thinking about, how do we repurpose what we already have in our economy to move towards a green energy future without just saying, we're going to let you decline, we're going to let these companies declare bankruptcy, and we're going to entirely rebuild somewhere else. That's just not a good use of resources or our productive capacity, and there's better solutions. And so I don't think a labor fight among an employer and workers is how you get that done. You really need to put forth a vision and pass it off to Congress, perhaps have Kamala Harris go to Congress and present this vision and really push them to move us towards a renewable energy future with shifting policy, with them using the power of the purse, and with a forward-thinking mindset.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And also this sort of discussion that supposedly, Biden has to choose between clean energy or his commitment supposedly to labor unions kind of reminds me of back when they were trying to undermine coal production, how they suggested, well, coal miners can just learn to code. It's a sort of out of touch understanding of how people who have high skilled jobs that the rest of the country doesn't understand, and the people setting these policies just sort of sets them up to look like fools when they actually announce these policies. So it'll be interesting to see whether Joe Biden makes the decision or maybe somebody else in the White House tries to make the decision for him. In terms of, again, you were talking this labor fight, it also kind of coincides very closely with the government shutdown deadline. What do you think sort of the economic pain would be if they don't reach a deal and this strike begins tonight?
Ooh, that's a really good point. I mean, we've seen the used car industry prices go up so much. We're already seeing inflation on the rise a little bit. We've seen energy prices go up a bit, and that, of course, affects the prices of everything else in the economy. But I think the consequence of a strike starting would be, whose side is Biden going to be on? The automobile industry is huge in the United States, and this is going to be one of those defining moments, I think, of his presidency if they decide to go on strike and they don't reach a deal, because Biden's going to have to make the case and explain what's going on, or maybe perhaps have his press secretary explain what's going on, either in the framing of the workers are causing our economy to lose some GDP or some productivity, or to say it is in fact the employers that are causing this decline in industry by not paying their workers fair wages and benefits. Especially, this is an egregious case because the workers willingly took pay cuts so that the industry would not collapse. And so they haven't been made whole again, despite the companies that they work for recouping those profits and those losses. And so this would be a huge defining moment. But economically, I don't see any sort of price increases for automobiles because we've seen decreased demand because these cars are not in production. I don't see that as something that's the fault of the workers. I really see it as the fault of the car manufacturers, and it puts everyday working people who need a vehicle to get to work and do their job in a tough position. If they have to buy a new one, they're choosing between extremely inflated prices of used cars or potentially, if we see the strike go on for some time, a very high price for a new vehicle. So it puts everyday people in an absolute mess. And there are these huge car manufacturers that can afford to pay their workers more and give more benefits. They're reaping in profits at the expense of everyone else, as well as their shareholders and investors. So again, it's one of those scenarios where the wealthiest people in the country end up faring quite fine either way, and everyday working people are struggling. It's time for Biden to step up, I think, especially if he wants a shot in 2024.
I'm reminded of President Biden's line that he and others in the White House often use, which is talking about how companies and individuals must pay their fair share. And I'll be interested to see if Biden trots that line out in this case to talk about these automakers. But again, it's a very different situation because these are people who are also typically supportive of Biden and what he's done and what other Democrats have done for the auto industry. But something to keep an eye on. The clock is ticking. We will be back with more Rising after this.